You'll get one of those days where you wonder why you do the job you do. I've had one of those days all this year, but particularly tonight I was talking to Wes, the producer for this week, saying, Wes, what am I doing here? I don't know, just... How the grass is green on the other side of the fence, is it? Perhaps you could let me know, is it? Are there other things I could do? I wouldn't ask you to recommend me for anything. It's just one of those days, it's all sort of silly. Well, see if these will inspire me here. No, there isn't. No. I suppose there's nothing to do but to go on. Now, here's a little item which has just come in. It's probably good news for Lorraine Cohen, I'm not sure. Now, she's been sitting on death row for 2 years. She's a former Sydney prostitute. Her name is Lorraine Cohen. Now, she's been given an unprecedented reprieve. She's won an appeal and had her death sentence reduced to 20 years in jail. Cohen and her son, arrested for possession of heroin, could spend as little as 9 years behind bars. Felicity Moffat has just filed this report from Kuala Lumpur.
An elated Lorraine Cohen walked from the Kuala Lumpur Supreme Court, given back her chance to live.
Give it.
Good, thank you.
Give it.
Go back to jail.
After 4 years in jail and 2 years on death row, it wasn't the decision she'd been expecting. The former King's Cross street girl had been prepared for the worst. In a crush of cameras and guards, Mrs. Cohen expressed her relief. She says now she'll write a book. The Supreme Court accepted a submission that Lorraine Cohen was a heroin addict and the drugs she was caught with at Penang Airport were for her own use and not for trafficking. Both Mrs. Cohen and her 22-year-old son Aaron had their sentences reduced to 20 years. Aaron still faces 6 lashes, but a confident defence counsel, Kapil Singh, spoke immediately of another appeal, this time to the Pardons Board.
Then addicts ought to be treated and rehabilitated, not imprisoned and whipped. On that score, I'll be making the necessary application to the Penang Pardons Board.
Lorraine Cohen goes back to Penang Jail tomorrow morning. With remissions and the time they've already served, she and her son now expect to stay in jail for another 9 years. In Kuala Lumpur, Felicity Moffat for Newsworld.
As Mr. Deruvo, one of our cameramen, said, what is the bad news if the lady could be in jail for 20 years in a jail in Kuala Lumpur? I'm not sure, actually. I wonder if she's keen about it. Sometimes death at least might be a release, mightn't it? Well, in a moment, we'll get on to the latest catfight in federal politics, but first, this is how Mrs. Eyre went to Singapore.
It's hard to believe Mrs. Joyce Eyre of Dianella could be mistaken for her husband Bill, who has black hair and a bushy beard. But that's exactly what immigration and other airport officials did when she boarded a Qantas flight with her elderly mother a week ago. It was only as she was filling out her arrival card before landing in Singapore she realised she had the wrong passport.
I burst into tears and I cried, I suppose, for about 4 hours straight.
The mistake detained Mrs. Eyre and her mother on the aircraft for an hour, then in a special detention centre at Changi Airport for 24 hours, while husband Bill back home frantically arranged for her own passport to be flown to Singapore.
It just wasn't checked. You know, it just wasn't checked. I mean, it wasn't looked at, the photograph wasn't looked at, because if it was checked, they could see that I was not, you know, my husband.
Mrs. Eyre is now asking how so many immigration and security checks broke down. Immigration and airline officials are also asking the same question. Now the Eyres have another problem. Mr. Eyre's passport carries a departure stamp but no arrival back into Australia. Mrs. Eyres has an arrival stamp, but according to her passport, she's never left the country. Alison Fan, Newsworld.
Much as I'm for equality for men and women, I can't believe a grown woman would burst into tears and cry for 4 hours. I just have no capacity to believe a grown woman would burst into tears and cry for 4 hours. If that's equality, I don't want it. Baby. Well, the good news for home buyers is that just about everybody agrees interest rates have reached their peak. And there is some light to be seen in the economic gloom. There is a tunnel somewhere with a light at the other end. Now, the bad news is that they all agree there won't be any reductions until next year.
Short-term interest rates moved back above 18% today as the market reassessed the prospects for an easing of monetary policy. Hopes for an early cut in rates were raised yesterday following a report that the government's budget surplus next year could be as high as $11 billion. The authors of the report say the market misread the significance of the figure.
On the basis of our assessment of the fundamentals of the economy, we'd say that there is zero scope for a sustainable reduction in interest rates in the near term.
That's a view shared by the Westpac Bank.
So perhaps we might start to see lower commercial interest rates before the end of the year and maybe lower mortgage interest rates during that first part of 1990.
It's that prospect which has prompted the Housing Industry Association to propose a new home loan plan to the government, offering low start loans to home buyers on a 5-year fixed interest rate as low as 14.5%. At present, to qualify for a $70,000 loan, home buyers need to earn around $40,000 a year. Under the proposed scheme, that requirement would be cut to about $27,500 a year. The Housing Industry Association says it's proposing a pilot program in which around $900 million in loans would be made to around 10,000 families over the next 12 months. In Canberra, Laurie Wilson for Newsworld.
Andrew Peacock is not worried. Just because a lot of people have trouble understanding what he's talking about doesn't mean the crusade has been lost.
For the next 7 days, this bulletin billboard will mock Andrew Peacock. On the eve of his mini-campaign tour last week, the magazine polled across the country, asked if they understood Peacock's economic policies. 3/4 said no. Asked if Peacock is a better policy salesman than his predecessor John Howard, a strong 40% backing for Howard. Those figures have shaken the Liberals. Party Federal Director Tony Eggleton argues the bulletin poll is out of date.
The bulletin poll didn't take into account our special efforts last week and our mini-campaign last week. And our latest research is showing that's had a very favourable impact, both for the party and for the leader.
The hollow man, as the bulletin calls Andrew Peacock, sticks to his own research.
I think, in fact, these things fluctuate, and we'll see steady improvement on that. I'm not troubled about that at all.
Do you concede you couldn't win a federal election on the basis of these Morgan pollers?